Thank you for coming this evening. I know given the weather, it's sort of hard to come out. So I don't have that much time to talk. We sort of decided I'd only talk for about 20 minutes. And usually when I talk in front of an audience about this, it's usually like an hour. So I'm going to make it pretty short. I'm just going to introduce the topic just briefly to all of you. And then I will tell you a story about a woman named Dinah. And we can take it from there. And please, when we're done, feel free to ask me any questions you want to ask. I don't mind answering any of them. In 1786, the Vermont legislature proudly declared that the idea of slavery is expressly and totally exploded from our free government. Those are great words. Yet the very same law being described actually undermined the very notion that slavery had been exploded from Vermont. The law itself demonstrates that black people were re-enslaved and sold to other areas after the promulgation of the 1777 Constitution, which granted freedom to slaves over ages 18 women and 21 men. The history of abolition in Vermont is often cited as a positive story about slavery during the Revolutionary era, and those are dwindling by the minute. We used to look at the Revolution as a time period when slavery might have ended in the United States, but I think most historians now don't quite buy that. They don't think it was close. Even in New England, slavery was continuing, even after the adoption of gradual emancipation. But Vermont is often cited as a positive story, standing alone as a monument to early American emancipation. But I think I would argue that the facts demonstrate a far more nuanced story of slavery and freedom in Vermont. And what I want to underline is that the end of slavery in Vermont, it's a process. It's something that happens over time. And that's a very important thing. It's not just something you can write into law in 1777 and then it will end. It's more of a process. The book that I wrote tried to make a few points about the complex history of Vermont slavery. The 1777 constitutional abolition of adult slavery did not end slavery in this state, but more importantly, it didn't establish meaningful freedom. There is a huge difference between ending slavery and establishing meaningful freedom. And of course, that's what was going on in the United States during, after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment might have ended slavery, but certainly Reconstruction did not establish meaningful freedom. So just to take this a little further, the legal reality of abolishing slavery did not always reflect social reality. The end of Vermont slavery was contested, contingent, complicated, and messy. Vermont made steps toward abolition, but slaveholding, kidnapping of free blacks, and child slavery continued until the early 19th century. It's very important. Those who continued to own slaves were among the most respectable inhabitants of the state, ranging from Supreme Court judge and member of the legislature Stephen Jacob, who I will be talking about again in a few minutes, to the prosperous leading citizen of North Bennington, Moses Sage. It is difficult to assess the percentage or number of Vermonters who either owned slaves or supported slavery, but it's probably fair to state that they probably constituted a decreasing minority during the late 18th century. However, if the question is the percentage of Vermonters who supported fugitive slave laws or the exile of blacks out of individual towns for alleged misdeeds, then I would argue that the numbers are probably a little bit higher. The point of the work that I did, the point of this book that I hope to get out to people, was not simply to show that Vermont had slavery or denied equality to free blacks. Why? Because it's quite clear that slavery persisted after 1777, and free blacks struggled for meaningful citizenship. Nor is the intention to argue that slavery and racism should be or are the dominant themes of Afro-Vermont history. Instead, the point here is to advance a more nuanced interpretation of local black history and race relations by including the story of slavery within the overarching themes of emancipation and freedom. The end of slavery, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, must be viewed as a long process that occurred over 30 years, during which time emancipation, slavery, freedom, racism, hopes for natural rights, re-enslavement, de facto slavery, and fleeting notions of black citizenship existed simultaneously. All of these things are going on in Vermont. So if you live in Vermont in 1792 and you're a black person, there's a lot of things that you could do. You could own property. You could take a white person to court. You could, at least allegedly, as far as we know, vote. There was no restrictions on you running for office. So you had a lot of things that a lot of other black people in North America could not do in, say, 1783 or 1785 or 1791. But at the very same time, if you were a black person, you might see your son or daughter kidnapped and sold outside of the state. You yourself could be kidnapped and re-enslaved. You yourself could still be a slave despite the 1777 Constitution. So you have all these different things going on in one place, right? I think a lot of times in history we want very simple answers. We want it to be one way or the other. We want Abraham Lincoln to be really great or really bad. But it's very rare in history that somebody is all evil all the time or all good all the time, no matter who you're talking about. So if I just go a little further with this, I think that what I've been talking about created a remarkable context for race relations, whereby Afro-Vermonters could achieve freedom in some aspects of meaningful citizenship, but also face a persistent threat of slavery, kidnapping, and the bondage of their children. An examination of Vermont slavery elicits multiple questions about its nature, essence, and eventual abolition. And let me just say, I'm not the first person to study this. People like Ray Zerbelis, good friend of mine, Kari Winter, Elise Guyette, lots of people have done work, and I'd like to think that my work has added to that. I don't see it as replacing that, and I don't want people to think that what I'm doing is like the last word on slavery in Vermont. It's just my own particular interpretation, and I'm sure later on people will go much further than I've gone, or at least I hope they will. But there's a few questions we can ask. For example, how emancipatory was the Abolition Provision of 1777? We can come back to that during the question period because we won't have time to delve into that. Why did the framers write the 1777 Abolition Provision in such vague terms? Why did Vermont forego enforcement provisions? How and why did slavery persist? Historian Ray Zerbelis argues that Vermont slavery, such as it is, dies a slow death. And he argued that the precise nature of servitude in Vermont after 1777 was not clear. People don't know exactly what it was. And therefore, I would say we need to understand the struggle between the forces of continued slavery and the movement toward freedom. These tensions in early Vermont beg for further study. Vermont historians can probe what the continuation of slavery in the state actually meant and how it affected free African Americans. And these are the things that I'm trying to find out. Without question, Vermont's 1777 abolition provision provided an essential foundation for the end of slavery in Vermont and other northern states. It's the first legislative example in a new world to end slavery. So it is important. It stands as an important monument to the slow legislative strangling of slavery in the North, yet we can recognize the wonderful anti-slavery stories that percolate throughout the state's history while placing them alongside the story of slavery in discussing slavery and its continuation in Vermont, and that's what we're going to do when I tell you about the Dinah case. This does not deny the Bennington Church's resistance to their slaveholding pastor David Avery in 1783, or the glowing significance of Ebenezer Allen's decision in 1777 to free a woman named Dinah Mattis and her daughter Nancy, because as he wrote on their freedom papers, it is not right in the sight of God to keep slaves. These examples provided black people with room to negotiate and advance their own freedom. And so that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. I have this very long section now that I don't have time to go over with you right here about the Vermont Constitution and what it actually said and what it actually did. So I'll just briefly condense that into less than a minute if I can. So is everybody with me? Yeah. Am I boring you? No. Okay. Keeping you awake? All right. So as we know, I mean, basically, just to give you a sense, the actual abolition provision is at the beginning of the Constitution, and it says, because we believe in natural rights, here's what we're going to do about this evil institution. And it says basically, therefore, no male person born in this country or bought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any person as a servant, slave, or apprentice after he arrives at the age of 21, nor female in like manner after she arrives to the age of 18 years. And then it said, with exceptions for debt, stuff like that, which was common to put people in jail or some sort of thing for debt or something like that. So what does this mean, and why did they do this? We don't really fully know why they adopted this. We have a few reasons. Some people think they did it because they wanted to sort of stop like a slave-owning aristocracy from like popping up in Vermont. But what I concentrate on when I look at this is sort of the limitations First of all, it leaves a huge, enormous loophole for children to be enslaved, right? So basically, if you're a black child and you're 4 years old and you're a male, you could be owned by your owner for the next 17 years. Those are productive years. In the late 18th century, 21 years, that's getting pretty old. And of course, as I say throughout the book, there's no enforcement mechanisms. Now, some of my critics have said, well, there's no enforcement mechanisms for other things in the Constitution. That's true, but later on they do change certain laws. They never add a law to sort of fulfill what the Constitution says until 1786, until 9 years after the Constitution, though they think about something in 1778. They form a committee, but it never passes a law, and we don't really know what the committee did. But what I want to emphasize is the fact that children were sold as slaves out of the state of Vermont, and so were just older black people. And that's why in 1786 you have the legislature passing what is called the Sale and Transportation Act, which basically says, if you do this to a black person, we're going to put you in jail for it. You really can't do this. But people continue to do it until the early 19th century. And I'm going to read you a law that was passed in 1806 that shows how slavery persists after 1777. So the point to get here is that even though you have the Constitution, and even though it is important, it lacks enforcement mechanisms, and it leaves a large loophole for children to be enslaved. And of course, let's be honest with ourselves. It's hard to put ourselves, I think, in today's world, what a slaveholder might have been thinking. But if you are a slave owner, and you own a slave, say in, I don't know, Springfield, Vermont, or something like that, right? Why would you free a slave? Why would you free an investment you made? Why wouldn't you just sell the slave? If you know that somebody might be coming along to your door to say, of course you're going to sell the slave. You could make a lot of money. You could just run it to the coast of Boston, or better yet, Rhode Island, and send it down to the Caribbean. Or, as what we think happened most often, sell it up to Montreal and then have it taken down to the French Caribbean. You're going to make a lot more money. And one example of this, before I give you the story about Dinah, is a little boy named Anthony. And I have to say that, as an African American, I'm 39 years old, and I've lived in Vermont for 10 years, and I've studied slavery for a long time, and I've written a couple books. I have to say that, in some ways I'm desensitized to slavery. I'm like almost desensitized to it because I've read so many documents related to slavery, so many revolting punishments, so many, everything you can imagine, all sorts of slave narratives. I'm sort of, after a while, it's like you see it and you're sort of looking at it as a historian rather than a person. But I always remind myself that these people are human beings. So anytime somebody says to me, well, there weren't that many slaves in Vermont, well, I always think to myself, well, tell that to Dinah, or tell that to this little boy, Anthony. And the story with Anthony really, really bothered me because here was a little boy. All we know about him was he was owned by a man by the name of Jotham White. Jotham White, not surprisingly, was a well-to-do person who was a member of the legislature, so he knew the law. He had this little boy, 7 years old, and there's a bill of sale. We only have a copy of it. We can't find the original right now. But basically, he, at 8 years old, he took this boy and sold this little boy, this little 8-year-old, to his brother-in-law, Oliver Hastings, who was living in Charlestown, New Hampshire at the time. It's a little 8-year-old boy. And I'm sitting there thinking, an 8-year-old boy in Vermont is a slave, African-American. He's sold and to Oliver Hastings. Oliver Hastings, a month later, sells the boy up to Quebec. And I would suspect either he was a domestic slave up there for a while, or he could have been a farm slave. But if the person wanted to make money, they probably sold him again. But just think about it. This is an 8-year-old boy who's been sold 2 or 3 times. And the documentation we have, we don't know who his mother was. Maybe it was Dinah, but I doubt it. It's possible. We actually just don't know. Know nothing about his father, unless Jotham White was his father, which is, given the Thomas Jefferson issue that we all know about with Sally Hemings, maybe that's not so far-fetched. We don't really know, though. So we know so little about these slaves, right? And that's a whole other issue. So what I wanted to tell you all about today, just focus on for the most part, was this story of this woman, Dinah, and then I will be happy to answer any questions. Jotham White owned an adult female slave in 1783. Same Jotham White. He seems to own all of the black people in this state in the 1780s. White owned Dinah. Dinah was 30 years old, and he sold her to a man by the name of Stephen Jacob, who would go on to become a Supreme Court justice. He was on the Council of Censors. He was in the Legislative Assembly. He's from Windsor. I'm going to tell you all about this. All of this comes to light as part of an 1802 state Supreme Court case that was to recover from Stephen Jacob the cost of maintaining his property. I'll explain this. So what is this all about? Dinah's personal history suggests several of the intricacies and contradictions of slave life in Vermont. In 1783, Jotham White sold his, and this is what the Bill of Sale says, Negro woman slave named Dinah, about 30 years of age, to Stephen Jacob of Windsor. But I want to underline that, in 1783. This is a clear violation of the Constitution. She's clearly 30 years old. That's clearly over 18. Everyone knows this. And the two people who are doing it are powerful people. People who will be in the legislature, people who know all the famous people, right? They know Ethan Allen. They know Thomas Chittenden. You know what I mean? These people are, these aren't just like people who are, these people like totally illiterate, totally don't know what's going on. They know what's going on. And so Jotham White sells her to Stephen Jacob, and historians, I have to admit, we know very little of Dinah's early life. Where was she born? We don't really know. Maybe Connecticut. How many times had she been sold prior to coming to Vermont? Did she have children or family nearby? What type of work did she do? Historical documentation about female slaves, not always, but sometimes, ranging from sexual exploitation to general patterns of life experience, can be limited. The few details we have about Dinah's life are intriguing. According to the 1791 and 1800 censuses, she probably lived in Judge Jacob's household with another black person. But historians know nothing about this other person because of the limited information on these censuses. And if I may digress for 1 second and point something out, the 1791 and 1800 census is very limited information. Dinah is returned on that census as she's just one black woman in Stephen Jacob's household, is listed as a free person. But we know she's not free. And this is another thing I dealt with in the book. There are a lot of ways that slavery is silenced in the records, right? We know Dinah's a slave, but she's recorded in the 1791 census as just a free black person. So one question that I ask in the book is how many people are returned as free-colored who really aren't free at all, right? Who really are slaves. So it's a tough question to ask. The other black person in Stephen Jacob's household, we don't know anything about. We don't know who this person was. We don't know if this was a relative, a friend. None of this is clear to us. What we do know is that local people considered Dinah, and this is a quote from the record, an excellent servant, and attempted to lure her away from Judge Jacob's household so she could work for them. Now, this is important. Dinah had a strong personality and refused to acquiesce to the demands of the town after Jacob's trial. In 1806 and 1807, Windsor selectmen in the town had warned Dinah out. Does everybody know what warning somebody out was back then? It's like you warned to get out of a town, to kick you out of a town, to make you leave a town. You're sort of warned to you have to leave. And they try to do this to Dinah, but she doesn't go. She refuses. And she ends up boarding with a bunch of different families. Local inhabitants eventually cared for Dinah during her final sickness, and eventually the town reimbursed these people for their medical treatment of what they referred to as Judge Jacob's Dinah. So who was Stephen Jacob? See, in contrast to Dinah, and this is the tragedy of slavery in some ways, is that Stephen Jacob's life, the slave owner, is well documented. After attending Yale, he settled in Vermont in 1778 and began practicing law. Certainly, he had read the state constitution and knew that it prohibited adult slavery. A man of ability, intelligence, and social standing, Jacob represented Windsor in the legislature and served on the Council of Censors in 1785. He also served on the governor's council and was actually literally sitting on the Supreme Court of Vermont during the time the selectmen of Windsor brought suit against him that ended up in the Supreme Court case. The case, everybody, was brought against him for cost incurred for taking care of his former slave. I will get more into this. This is not a court case of it's wrong that he owned a slave. It's about money. It's about cost. You'll see what I mean in a second. Described as an aristocratic federalist, as if there's any other kind of federalist, Jacob continued to be a respected member of local society despite his blatant disregard for the law he had sworn to uphold. Dinah worked as Judge Jacob's slave for approximately 17 years, from the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783. She probably performed numerous domestic tasks, including washing clothes, cooking, cleaning, yard work. According to the court record, though, and this is where it gets very interesting, it's a little bit complicated, Dinah, quote-unquote, continued to live with and serve him as a slave until sometime in the year 1800. Although only 47 years of age, Dinah had become infirm, sick, and blind. Jacob allegedly discarded Dinah, and she became dependent on public charity, which had to pay for her medicine, support, and attendance. At this point, the Selectmen of Windsor only brought suit, and this is very important, when Dinah's freedom became a burden to the public treasury, not out of any sense of outrage that Judge Jacob had illegally enslaved her for almost 2 decades. That wasn't the issue. Since the plaintiffs sought to recover damages incurred for caring for Dinah, they needed first to establish that she had been Jacob's slave. And how do you establish that somebody had been somebody's slave? Well, you could have eyewitnesses, but the best thing to probably do was to show them a bill of sale with Stephen Jacob's name on it. I bought this woman, Dinah, from Jotham White. And as it turns out, they had the bill of sale. So this can't be a problem, you're thinking. Actually, it can be. The court case shows the almost comical lengths to which the Vermont Supreme Court would go to deny the de facto existence of slavery by asserting its de jure illegality. The crux of the case hinged on the plaintiff's attempt to introduce Dinah's bill of sale into evidence. The defense attorney for Jacob, his name was Charles Marsh, objected to this request by arguing, as he said, no person can be held in slavery in this state, and the showing of a bill of sale can be no evidence that this unfortunate being here, it's supposed to be transferred by it, is a slave. He concluded that the bill of sale that showed Dinah was a slave was actually void because of the first article of the 1777 Vermont Constitution. This despite the authenticity of the bill of sale and the fact that the court and community all knew that Jacob held Dinah as a slave. So it's like they're dealing with this like legal reality, but this like social fiction. And it's, I mean, everyone knows Jacob owned Dinah. If you lived in Windsor between 1785 and 1800, you know that he had a slave. It's not, you would know that now. Windsor's bigger. Back then, it's small. Everybody knows. Everybody's in everybody's business, right? And he's a respectable guy, right? And as we say in Africa, he's a big man. Everybody knows who Jacob was, right? You couldn't move to Windsor and not know him. So what happens? Well, Judge Jacob's got a pretty good attorney. And he argued that his client could not bear responsibility for the money spent by the town because slavery did not exist in Vermont. This despite, as I said, the authenticity of this bill. The attorney, everybody, for the plaintiffs, right, for the Selectmen of Windsor, attacked this reasoning because it excused Vermont slaveholders who continued to flaunt the law from any sort of responsibility for their black servants or slaves who could be turned out of the house when no longer useful. The plaintiff's counsel, Jonathan Hubbard, highlighted the continuation of slavery in Vermont as late as 1800 and the dangers of ignoring it. He argued, and I like his argument, he said that though no person can hold a slave de jure by our Constitution, yet there may exist among us a slave de facto. And for those, if you're not de facto, it's like in reality. In fact, de jure just means legally. So, if we use a famous example from African-American history, black people allegedly should have been allowed to vote, black men at least, should have allegedly been allowed to vote after 1870. But there were a lot of black men not voting in 1920 in Alabama, right? It's a big difference between de jure and de facto. And I'm more interested, even though I do legal history, on reality on the ground. This is where I part company with my legal historian friends. He argued as I said, again, I love the language here. No person, let's hear it again, can hold a slave de jure by our Constitution, yet there may exist among us a slave de facto. He also shifted to higher ground, and I love this. He said that if a master will hold an African in bondage as a slave, contrary to right, and for a succession of years, during which the slave de facto spends the vigor of her life in his service, and in which she may be presumed to have earned for the master sufficient to maintain her in the decrepitude of old age, there is a moral obligation upon the master to support her when incapable of labor. He further argued that the laws of the United States which acknowledge slavery held sway in Vermont. So it's also a federal state argument, right? Whoever thought that Vermont state rights could be argued in this way? He further argued that in doing this, he needed to acknowledge the reality of slavery. You couldn't just fall back on what a law said. But Jacob's attorney, Marsh, offered a weak but very effective rebuttal. According to him, Judge Jacob had brought Dinah into Vermont, and, as he argued, there can be but little doubt from the excellent character and disposition of her master, she would have so continued until this time in sickness and in health. He accused the selectmen, in fact, and others, of enticing Dinah away from Judge Jacob. Marsh recounted that, quote, discovering she was a most excellent servant and wishing to profit themselves of her labors, they inveigled her from her master's family and service by the siren songs of liberty and equality, which have too often turned wiser heads. Marsh asserted that they had wasted her strength in their service and she became blind and paralyzed. As a result, he denied that Judge Jacob could be held responsible for her maintenance. In an argument of, I can only say, amazing hypocrisy, Judge Jacob's counsel claimed that his client did not attempt to retrieve his slave, quote, in obedience to the Constitution, because Jacob believed he could not legally hold her as a slave. This in spite of the fact that he had done so for the better part of 2 decades. Jacob denied that he should be responsible for maintaining Dinah and that the best way to deal with this situation would be to warn her out of town. Jacob clearly felt little concern for Dinah at all. So what happens? So the judges have to make a decision. There's an assistant judge who's very famous, Roy L. Tyler. You might recognize that name. He says, well, the Vermont Constitution strictly outlawed slavery, and the federal Constitution did not affect this particular case, according to him. He thus objected to the bill of sale being introduced as evidence. He took very little notice of Hubbard's argument about the de facto continuation of slavery. Tyler preferred to adhere to the wording of the Constitution of 1777 rather than to examples of how this provision had been ignored, subverted, and contradicted. The chief judge agreed with him, and as a result, the plaintiffs were non-suited. So Jacob won. It's one of the most interesting cases. Let me just mention, it has several significant points for us today. One, it seems that the residents of Windsor accepted Jacob's slaveholding. They knew of the enslavement of this woman. The court case itself showed the willingness of the justices to accept a legal fiction that slavery did not exist because the state constitution banned it, while ignoring the reality of slaveholding. The judges certainly knew that their fellow judge had a slave in his household. They seemed unwilling to admit that one of their own had so brazenly broken the law and defied the Constitution. Just as disturbing, the court indicated that slaveholders did not owe their manumitted ex-slaves any support or sustenance, though they had spent their lives laboring for an individual or family. And I think that that's very, very important. Last thing I want to mention to you all tonight, and then I'll be happy to have a discussion, is the law I told you about. It's called the Prevention of Kidnapping Act. It's 1806. And the reason why this law is so important and so special is because it comes almost 30 years to the day, almost 30 years after the 1777 constitutional abolition provision. And what's in here is very important. The General Assembly, 1806, and remember, this is also 20 years after the Sale and Transportation Act, which doesn't do enough. It tries, but it doesn't quite get it done. And this is in 1806, and I think this is very telling. So what the General Assembly admits, okay? They say, Whereas, and the wording here is very important, whereas there have been a number of instances of Negro persons who were minors having been transported by evil-minded persons from this to the other states in the province of Canada, where slavery is established by law and they're disposed of as slaves, which practice is contrary to the genius and principles of the good people and government of this state. They passed something called the Prevention of Kidnapping Act. And if they had done this in 1778, it might have prevented all these stories that we have. And basically, what this bill does is it just brings a hammer down. It says, if we catch you doing this, we'll sentence you to 7 years of hard labor. We will put you in public and whip you publicly with 39 lashes. So it's like a public shaming and put you in jail. And so that's a big step. So I think overall, what I'd like to just close on by saying is that slavery is part of Vermont's history. And I'm not saying it's more important than freedom or free blacks were in this state, but I am saying that we needed to come to grips a little bit more with what slavery meant in Vermont and what the legislative end of slavery looked like. Did it really just end in 1777, or was it a very long process that took over 3 decades to complete? And if it took those 3 decades to complete, what was going on during that time? And is this similar? Is this different to other states? So on and so forth. And that's what I did in my book. So thank you for that abbreviated talk. Please, anybody. I guess I'll start here and go around.
I guess I had a question at the beginning, and I think you partly answered it through your talk. It's almost like how the myth, because we have a myth. I mean, history is all full of myths and realities, right?
Sure.
About what we think of ourselves as this. So we all hold up the Constitution, Vermont being this leader, and then we hear the truth, and we're like, well, maybe. But you wonder where it got started. But it sounds like even back at the time, the myth was pretty strong.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder, I almost feel like maybe that would be a much more interesting or long-standing topic. I don't know, this question of memory. Some of the early historians that you read, like Daniel Chipman, they acknowledge this very early on. This is like 1840s. They'll say, well, yes, we did adopt this, but we do know from these other laws that were passed later on, in fact, there must have been slaves here. But as Vermont's identity becomes more tied up in freedom and abolition, and there is great legitimacy to that, I don't want to take that away, these kind of inconvenient truths, inconvenient facts don't really fit well into that much broader narrative. And I think that possibly, after the Civil War, part of the whole thing is like, come up to Vermont, visit Vermont, and visit our Underground Railroad sites and so on and so forth. And I think it's not just slavery, it's also something like the Vermont Colonization Society, which was a local auxiliary of the American Colonization Society, which was incredibly popular in Vermont, especially before the advent of sort of radical abolitionism in the 1830s and 1840s. Or, in this Colonization Society was devoted to getting all free blacks out of the United States and sending them back to Africa. It was posited on the belief that black people simply could not live in an integrated, multiracial or biracial American democracy. And the people who supported this group, the Vermont Colonization Society, included people like John Wheeler, former president of the University of Vermont, and in fact his house is where my office is. How disappointed he'd be. But I mean, so I think, so absolutely, to answer your question, I think that I think as people wanted to develop that idea of Vermont in its part in the national narrative, right? We're a small state, we're a small state. People in New England think we're small. So if you, and I've lived all over the country and all over Canada, so if you're in Colorado, Vermont's just doesn't make any sense, right? So how do we stand out? And our role in the national narrative, one part of it is our leading role in abolitionism and ending slavery, which I think still stands intact after this book. I don't want people to think that I wrote this book to tear that down. But there's other things. So the difference between, slavery, indentured servitude, de facto slavery. I mean, when a Vermonter sees a black person in 1778, they might just assume that they're a slave. They might. Do you know what I mean? And what decides whether they are or not? This is because you can have all the laws in the world, but if on the ground, if the reality, Dinah legally should have been free, but she was a slave. Anthony should not have been allowed to be sold outside of the state, but he was. And these are just the stories that we know about. And there's all sorts of other little things. Just to give you a few examples, I found one black person who's listed on a will in Bennington in 1782. We have a few different bills of sale. One is for a little girl named Rose. She's 14 years old, and she's bought for a pretty substantial price at that time. She's 14 years old. I'm sitting there thinking, there is no way this guy is going to free her in 4 years from now if he made this investment. That's just crazy. And the interesting thing is sometimes in households in Vermont, and you'll notice it's in the 1791 census, which is really strange, there's like 4 or 5 households where there's like 10 black people living in one white household in various parts of the state. A few are down like in, outside of Brattleboro. One is in Addison County. Sort of like, wait a minute, what does this mean? Are these people free? Are they, maybe this person is doing them a favor. Maybe he's paying them wages, or maybe not. So it's very hard to tell. So, yeah.
Did you find any record of an African American held as a slave who knew the laws and tried to do recourse to public?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Actually, we do have a story in here of a guy by the name of Pompey Brackey. It's a very interesting story, because we had to sort of piece it together through a few different sources, and Judge Robert Mello had found this for me. Pompey Brackey was a man who we think was owned by somebody in the Lavelle family. And there's a mention of it by a commissioner of sequestration, because people in the Lavelle family, I think some of them were loyalists. So one person just sort of makes a note. It's a very messy note, and it just says, somebody, either Elijah or Timothy Lovell, claims that they have a bill of sale for said Pompey. This is like 1778, so it's quite clear that this person is claiming a slave even a year after the Constitution. So it's like, wow, okay. So what happens? Turns out, somehow or another, Pompey Brackey goes to court. Like, literally goes to court against this guy, against this person from the Lavelle family, and the judge calls Lavelle like 2 or 3 times to the bench. The guy never shows up. So they award Pompey Brackey 412 pounds. It's an astronomical amount of money it's like an astronomical amount of money to give to a former slave. It's like, that's a lot of money to give to anybody, but to a former slave. But here's a problem with the court records. We don't know what the charge was. We don't know what it's about. We just know the judgment. Fortunately, some of the court records in Vermont are very skimpy. I went down to Rutland, and we looked at the court records. It just says, this person. It doesn't even mention he's black. Because of the name Pompey Brackey, right? But, if his name had been John Smith, maybe he was black, right? But it turned out that he won it. Now, how did Pompey Brackey do this? How did he find out about his rights? Why did he wait a year? Like, the court case itself wasn't, I think, until May 12th or May 5th, 1779. And we know he was claimed as a slave according to the Commissioner of Sequestration in June of 1778. So it took a while. We know the Constitution, summer 1777. So, how did he find out? And he got lucky. He went to a court. He found a friendly judge. He got an award. It's interesting. So it shows that these things can go both ways. So there's an example of a black person using the court system to their advantage. But I would also point out to you, that also shows you how slavery persisted, right? Because this guy gets busted, Lavelle, a little bit later. How many other examples are there of people like Lavelle who continue to own slaves? So I think it cuts both ways. I have one of my senior colleagues. He's pretty cynical. He always says, I wrote, how could they verify their age in one of my first drafts? And he wrote in parentheses, like, if they even cared. Right? And that's the thing, if they even would bother to even look. Because it's a huge issue over enforcement. And I have to say, we don't want to be too hard on Vermont, because everybody is dealing with this. Okay, okay, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, all these states that adopt gradual emancipation, all of them end up having to pass laws later on trying to stop the sale of black people out of the state, right? Now, in a state like Pennsylvania or Rhode Island, or a place like Massachusetts even, those places is really dangerous because they're right on the ocean. And that's just a nice hop, skip, and a jump down to the Caribbean, where you could sell a slave in the 1780s in Jamaica or the Caribbean, other places, for a lot more money. So, I mean, the problems that Vermont faces, lack of enforcement, loopholes, all of this stuff, not freeing children until 21 and 18. In Pennsylvania, I think it's like 28. I mean, so these things are going on in all of these other places. So, absolutely. Please.
Same idea, like, so I'm relatively new to learning about gradual emancipation, because if you just get the sort of plaque or poster on the sidewalk, you know, when historical building, when slavery was abolished, it gives the name, the date of the law, as opposed to the last time when it was absolutely abolished.
Right.
So, like, you keep saying Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, but I think New Hampshire.
Oh, well.
It was like 16, you know.
Yeah.
They passed some law, but it was like 60 years or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, in New Hampshire, it's a very long process, and also in Connecticut, I think New Jersey has a few slaves as late as like 1860, but they're the last ones to adopt gradual emancipation in 1804.
It's like they should rewrite the history books and say, like, just put new dates on it. I think it would go a long way towards changing the myth, or shifting the myth at least, or at least
making people think about it. Yeah.
It does strike me that you know, maybe whoever the name of the person was that won the 412 pounds, maybe they never even got their money.
That's a great point, right? I mean, that's, you know, and I mean, to be honest with you, if there's one thing I do know, it's that, you know, to really know a lot about slavery or a lot about how the courts worked, I think you'd have to do two things. You'd have to go through all. If I had the choice, I would go through all of the newspapers in Vermont that were published from, I don't know, maybe as early as I get, maybe 1783, I think, Vermont Gazette. And I've gone through a lot of those up until about 1810, and look in the advertisement section and find every example of runaway slaves that you can find. I have a bunch of them I found in the Vermont Gazette. But just to get an idea of what is going on. The second thing I would look for would be to look at court records. But the court system in Vermont, especially like the lower court, county court records, some of them they're in different, unfortunately, they're still at county courthouses. They haven't been centralized. We're starting to centralize. Like some of the records from, say, Windsor are actually now in the state archives down in Middlesex, and that's great. But they're not the best organized. They're not organized in a way that you can do quick searching. Sometimes because the way they have them organized is just by name. Other places you go, they'll have it by name and by subject, so you know. Like it'll say wrongful imprisonment. Well, if you're studying slavery, wrongful imprisonment, writ of habeas corpus, that's something I want to look at. Or kidnapping, that's something I want to look at. But when it's just, say, you know, Harvey Amani Whitfield, Craig, my former student, right? I mean, nobody knows what that case is, right? I mean, unless you're, so that it would take a monstrous amount of time, and I don't know if I can explain to my to my superiors at the University of Vermont that yes, I've looked for something for 4 years, but I haven't found anything. I mean, I have 10 years, so I mean, what can they do to me, right? But I mean, but you know, you want to be productive, you want to write something. So I'm still trying to figure out how much further I would go with this if I could.
Along the same lines about that same case, I mean, that's another example where the court can say, oh, wow, we did this major penalty in this one case. I think there's a great excuse to overlook the other 10 cases because they've already done their job.
And we'll have to look. It's very hard to tell. I mean, I'll give you another, just before we close, I'll just give you all another example that, you know, we know that slavery goes on even past 1810. For example, you know, in the 1810 census, there's at least 2 slaves. They're literally in the census, which is more than we could say in the 1791 and the 1800 census. But one of the most interesting cases is Ethan Allen's daughter, Lucy Carolyn Hitchcock. She had married and lived in Alabama, I believe in Mobile. And she owned some, of course, the family she moved in with down there owned slaves. And so she came back up to Burlington in the 1830s, right? And she had 2 slaves, like openly was owning 2 slaves in Burlington and had them for many years in the 1830s at the height of like when, you know, when sort of, you know, immediate abolitionism is starting to take off. There's 2 slaves owned by this woman. Everybody knows, I mean, you know, here she is. They've got her. And eventually they end up getting their freedom, but it's after several years. So we just need to figure out what that meant.
Do you think she might have changed the language that she used to talk about? Just when she moved, she might have used the word slave, and
no, I think,
and then started to use different language because the laws were different in Vermont. Or do you think that it was any influence?
No, I don't think.
Different, or?
No, I don't think so. Because I think if you look at Marshall True wrote an article about this. He's a former retired faculty member at the University of Vermont, called "Slavery in Burlington," with a question mark. I think it's in the 1982 edition of Vermont History, and he sort of cites these documents. And I've looked at them. I don't think that she was doing that. The other thing you have to remember is that people could bring slaves into Vermont. You know, you could have a slave in Vermont, and that person would remain a slave as long as you weren't considered a resident, whatever that means, right? So when you were considered a resident, then you had to free this person. And let me just mention also that, you know, in allowing slave owners access to child slaves, like in allowing them access to child slaves, you know, that's a form of de facto compensation. You must remember, today when we talk about compensation for slavery, we're talking about like reparations to descendants of slaves. Back then, when they were talking about compensation, they did not mean to slaves. They meant to slave owners. And you must remember how important private property was to this generation of people. Like, this is a serious issue for them. So if you end slavery, you are taking away somebody's private property. And if you're taking away somebody's private property, you are messing with another person's alleged natural rights. So one wonders if, in sort of saying, well, yes, we want to end slavery, but we're going to sort of slow it down a little bit. You know, a man can't be free until he's 21, a woman 18. Was that giving them some form of compensation? Something that we come across all the time in a lot of other states. Just something to think about out loud.
Could they have been thinking of it as a way of grandfathering in? Like if you already own someone, we're not going to mess with that. But anything new is not going to happen.
Well, but sure. Well, that's exactly.
That's their logic.
That's well, right. Well, I mean, in some ways, that's exactly what they're doing. Of course, I mean, it's and you see this in other states. I mean. Obviously, gradual emancipation is really what's adopted in many different northern states. You know, just a slow sort of, in New York in 1799, but that's why you can have so many slaves in New York for so many years to the point where they actually have to adopt the end of slavery in 1827. It's pretty late, I mean, it's very important.
It's a little different topic, but pre-Revolutionary War, could you buy your freedom? I mean, I'm fascinated by this image of free blacks in the North and slaves all living together. Just how bizarre that would have been.
Well, you can buy. I mean, you can gain your freedom. Some people call it manumission. Like an owner can manumit an individual slave. And the free black population is not extremely large before the Revolutionary War, but it grows tremendously after the Revolutionary War. One reason is because black people run away. The other reason is because many northern states start to adopt emancipation, gradual emancipation, and also many northern owners start to say, "Oh my, this is truly wrong, owning slaves. I should free my slaves. How can I fight for my own liberty and enslave enslave this human being?" I know why it seems unnatural or weird to you that a free black and a slave might interact and talk together. But in places where they're able to do that, it's very normal that, there are marriages between free blacks and slaves in the North. That is not uncommon. And it even goes on sometimes in the South as well. Yeah, so. Please.
Just going back to the child slave clause.
Sure.
Wondering if another reason why they would have such a huge loophole like that is because of the financial fallout. Like if they just decided to end it deciding that people that couldn't own slaves, no matter how old the slave was. I mean, that's kind of like have somebody doing that work, and you have to hire somebody to do that. Would that be some kind of financial?
And the other thing, if we're going to be, we want to try to be fair to the Vermont founders. I mean, it's like one thing is I'm sure that they thought these people, these children, will be poor, right? They might not have parents, and what will we do with them? So some of my critics say, well, they could have, when they left this loophole, they really meant it just so they could be apprentices, which is, I could see that as truth, but in other northern emancipation statutes, they use the word specifically apprentices. They don't use that in the Vermont one, right? They don't do that. And they had a chance to revise that at the 1785 Council of Censors, and they didn't. And I think that it is possible that they thought, maybe in the back of their mind, look, these people are going to be poor. If people know that they're going to be free, maybe they'll teach them to read the Bible. This is like on the good side, right? Not being cynical. Maybe we'll teach them to read a Bible. They'll teach, little Quash how to read. They'll teach them the Bible, and they'll teach him how to be a carpenter. But somebody will need to raise this child before that will be. So that could be another possibility. So there's all sorts of potential reasons why the founders do what they did. And I have a much longer section I wish I could have shared with you, but go ahead.
Part of it could be, too, that children's rights are not recognized.
Well, this goes without, yes, and this goes.
Every child didn't have those rights.
Sure. Well, that's a great point. Every child, very few children had any rights, right? This is good. He's sitting right. He's like, wait a minute, what? No, so they had very few. They did have very few rights, and of course, especially poor children have very few rights. But if you were like a poor white indentured servant, right? And remember, they're white indentured servants, and you were a poor black slave. I mean, how many rights did you really have? I mean, it's not a good life.
It must also be true from that time period that it's really hard to tell what the debate was that went into the actual laws that we have written. All we have are the written laws, but the record of the debate went on, or the reasons behind,
right,
just don't get recorded as much. Maybe in someone's diary, but is that true?
In our case, it's just not very good. Now, like the Constitutional Convention, the reason why we know a lot about it is because James Madison sat there, like the note-taking weirdo he was, and just wrote down. I mean, so we have what he actually thinks, and so we have these. So we know why the Three-Fifths Compromise, what the debate was. In Vermont, the convention notes are extremely scanty. And we don't know exactly what the public felt about things because it wasn't presented to the public to be ratified. So we are going on very little information. And so, I have a long section in the book where I sort of talk about why do they do this? What does this actually mean? And it is very hard to tell, why they did this. I mean, I think partially Randolph Roth, a historian, wrote, it was there to prevent a labor-degrading, slave-owning aristocracy. And I think that that's probably true to a point, but we don't know all the things that went into or motivated Vermont leaders to do this, and why they were, if we found out why they were motivated to do this, why they ended up not doing quite enough. Now, we could defend them, and we can say, and I do in the book to an extent, I say, look, they don't really have any other model to work with. I mean, if you're in New York and you're doing this in 1799, you can look at the abolition provisions, all over the North, right? If you're in New Jersey, you've got a bunch to look at. But if you're Vermont in 1777, what are you looking to? Lord Dunmore's proclamation freeing slaves of patriot owners in Virginia in 1775? A British governor, who's a total military necessity? They're not doing it. And the other thing you have to think about is I don't know if they considered what they were doing as much as maybe we would have liked them to. Why? Because when they're sitting there writing it, John Burgoyne's British Army is coming through the Champlain Valley, and they're probably thinking, we're going to get crushed. I mean, so they're free, and they're sitting there writing, like looking over their backs saying, You know, is this, are we, you know, what's going to happen to us? So I think that that's part of it as well. So there's a lot going on here. And what is clear, let me just mention, is that the government probably did not think that they had done enough. Because in 1778, as I said, there was a committee, and according to the legislative record, it says, a committee of 3 should be appointed to prepare a bill respecting the freedom of slaves agreeable to the Bill of Rights. They mean the Vermont Bill of Rights. But the committee never introduced a bill. We don't know what that committee did. Look, maybe there's a scrap sheet of paper lying around that nobody's found, or maybe a better historian will find something than me that'll tell us what they actually talked about on this committee. But they didn't pass a law, and it wouldn't be until 1786 that something was actually done. And what does that mean? And I should also mention, as long as we're on the subject, you know, this idea of natural rights. You always think of natural rights as being like, I know I always thought of it as like this great thing. Natural rights sounds good. Everybody wants a natural right. Sounds terrific, right? Until Winthrop Jordan, who's probably one of the greatest historians that ever lived, pointed out that natural rights can be limiting. It can literally be a limiting philosophy, right? Because all natural rights tells you is not to abuse someone else's rights. That's it, right? Don't take away this person's freedom. It's a negative. And the point with that is, in that sense, that's not very liberating. So maybe when the Vermont founders said, well, we're going to end slavery for these few black people who are here because it's kind of wrong, maybe they thought they'd done enough. That was it. They didn't need to do any more, right? They needed to end slavery, but they weren't going to do anything to establish meaningful freedom. That's all they were going to do. Maybe they just said, look, a natural right is for us not to enslave you. But after that, you're on your own, buddy. So I think that that's another potential thing. Yeah. So. You think about somebody like Stephen Jacob, I don't know, I mean, if you're a person, you live in Windsor, and you think there's something wrong with owning slaves, and you're just an average person in Windsor, are you going to go tell His Eminence, Stephen Jacob, that he's a jerk? You might be borrowing money from him. Back then, rich people lent money to, you know, they always would be passing out money, and I think that maybe they were sort of scared to do it. Now, I think when you look at something like David Avery's situation, and I go into great detail in this book about David Avery. He was a guy, he came up to Bennington, he owned a slave woman, and then basically he was thrown out of the first Bennington church, or the first Congregational church. He's sort of thrown out because of, people like to say, well, this was because he had a slave. But other historians are like, actually, no. It's not because of that. That was one of the reasons. The other reason was because they thought that he didn't preach the faith very honestly. Like it was straying from how Christianity should be taught. And that's what upset people. And other people have said, and again, Judge Mello did a great job on this, have shown that the real issue that people had with him, or that there were people in his congregation who were opposed to him owning a slave, but they were probably in the minority. There's probably, you know, the radicals who were like, this is wrong to own a slave, were probably just a few. And the people like that who actually thought that were eventually kicked out of the church. They go through this whole I go through this whole story in the book about a guy, I think his name is Henry or Harry Walbridge, who just freaks out. He doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And all these very famous later Vermont politicians like Moses Robinson, all these other people, try to get this guy to come back into the church. They're like, come on back in, come on back in. You know, and he's like, no, I won't be part to this. But these other very powerful Vermonters ended up sort of, even if they sort of didn't like slavery, being okay with it. Another thing I'd point out to you is I talked about, I think it was in Bennington, this the estate paper which lists a slave on it. This is signed by local judges, including people who go on to be later governors, okay, and later high-ranking politicians. They knew. Now the question is, what did an average, you know, white Vermonter with a sheep think? I don't know. I mean, like, that's a terrific question. Were they alienated? That's a question that is a beautiful question that at this point I cannot fully answer. Well, thank you all so much.